The clanging of steel echoed down the long, dimly lit corridor as Michael Johnson was escorted back to his cell. The sound was almost rhythmic, a harsh metallic reminder of the world he lived in, the world of death row. To most people outside, prison was an abstract concept, a place they heard about in news headlines or crime documentaries. But to Michael, it was a suffocating reality that pressed down on him with every second that passed. He had been here for over a decade, convicted of a crime that had shocked the state. For years, newspapers had painted him as a monster, a villain beyond redemption. His mugshot had been plastered across television screens, his name whispered with contempt in diners, workplaces, and homes. Yet inside those gray prison walls, Michael was not a headline. He was just another man waiting for time to run out. The routine was numbing. Every morning, the fluorescent lights snapped on at the same hour. Breakfast was served through a slot in the door, tasteless and mechanical. Guards patrolled with heavy boots and tired expressions, treating the condemned with a cold detachment that came from years of repetition. Inmates shouted, laughed, cried, and sometimes prayed, but the atmosphere never changed. It was always heavy, always filled with the lingering knowledge that everyone there was on borrowed time. But in Michael's cell, there was something different. While others clung to letters from wives, mothers, or children, Michael had only one constant thought: Max. Max wasn't just a dog. He was Michael's shadow, his companion, his anchor in a life that had been spiraling long before the trial. Max was a yellow Labrador with soft, intelligent eyes and a coat that glowed golden under sunlight. Michael could still remember the day he brought Max home a rainy afternoon when the puppy's oversized paws had slipped across the porch tiles, making Michael laugh for the first time in weeks. From that day forward, Max never left his side. When Michael's life started to unravel, when bills piled up, when bad choices led him into darker company, when the world seemed determined to push him down, it was Max who stayed. Friends abandoned him, family grew distant, but Max remained, curling beside him at night, licking his hand after every long, weary day. Even on the night of his arrest, Max had been there. Michael could still see it, the flashing red and blue lights, the sharp bark of orders, the cold steel of handcuffs. And in the chaos, Max had stood at the door, whining, scratching, trying to follow as officers dragged Michael away. That image burned into his memory more than the trial itself. Now, years later, as he sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, Michael's chest tightened at the thought of his loyal companion. He had lost everything: his freedom, his future, the possibility of a normal life. But what hurt most was losing Max. Rumors always circulated in prison. Some said his dog was still alive, cared for by a distant cousin. Others claimed Max had grown old and frail, perhaps already gone. Letters from relatives were scarce, and updates about Max were vague at best. Still, Michael held on. He pictured Max's tail wagging, pictured him running through fields, pictured the weight of his head resting on Michael's knee, as if the years apart had never happened. The closer his execution date approached, the stronger these images became. Nights grew longer, sleep harder to find. He would lie awake, listening to the distant hum of generators and the occasional clatter of a guard's keys, his mind replaying every memory with Max, as though his heart was trying to cling to one final piece of meaning. It was during one of those sleepless nights that the thought struck him. Soon, officials would ask about his final meal, his last words, his final request. Most men asked for lavish dinners, greasy hamburgers, steaks dripping with juice, or family visits. Some asked for books, cigarettes, or religious rituals. But Michael didn't care about any of that. Food was meaningless now, rituals hollow. What mattered most was something officials might laugh at, something so simple it felt almost foolish. He wanted to see Max. At first, he pushed the thought aside. Prison was built on rules, and rules rarely bent. But the more he thought about it, the more it consumed him. Would the guards allow it? Would anyone even care? He had been branded a criminal, a man unworthy of sympathy. Yet, despite the weight of his crimes and the coldness of the world around him, Michael's heart clung to one undeniable truth. Max had never judged him. The dog had loved him in his worst moments, loved him through mistakes, loved him without condition. And if this was truly the end, if time was finally slipping from his hands, Michael couldn't bear to leave this world without saying goodbye. He began to whisper his wish to himself, repeating it over and over like a prayer. Just one more time. Just once. Days later, when the warden arrived at his cell to review the final protocols, Michael's voice cracked as he spoke. The guards expected him to ask for a heavy meal or some small comfort. Instead, he surprised everyone. I just want to see my dog." For a moment, silence filled the corridor. The warden's eyes narrowed, unsure if he had heard correctly. Guards exchanged puzzled glances. One scoffed under his breath, muttering that it was a waste of time. But others, though hardened by years of dealing with prisoners, felt a strange pull at their hearts. In the sterile halls of death row, where humanity was often stripped away, Michael's request sounded startlingly human. The warden jotted it down with hesitation, saying nothing more. Yet even as he walked away, murmurs began to ripple among staff. Some laughed at the absurdity of it. Others, however, felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: sympathy. Michael leaned back against his cot, his chest heavy, but his mind alive with hope. For the first time in years, he had spoken a desire not out of fear or regret, but out of love. He didn't know if the warden would honor his wish, but he knew one thing for certain. If his final moments in this world were to come, he wanted them to come with Max by his side. The morning was gray when the warden finally came to Michael's cell, clipboard in hand, voice firm and practiced. It was part of the ritual, one repeated countless times with other men before him. The condemned were given the courtesy of a final request, a last meal, a phone call, sometimes a spiritual advisor. To most inmates, it was a chance to taste freedom one last time through a plate of ribs or fried chicken, to feel a shred of comfort before the end. But Michael wasn't like most. When asked what he wanted, he sat silently for a long while, hands resting on his knees, eyes staring through the steel bars as if he could see beyond the walls. Guards shifted impatiently. Some expected him to ask for a meal. Others assumed he'd demand cigarettes or some rare indulgence. The silence was unusual, and even the warden raised an eyebrow, waiting. Finally, Michael spoke. "I don't care about food. I don't care about drinks. I just want to see Max. My dog." The words fell into the air like a stone into still water, rippling outward. The guard nearest to him snorted. "A dog? You've got to be kidding." But Michael didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the warden, his face drawn yet earnest. "That's all I ask. Just let me see him. One last time." For a moment, there was silence, then a burst of low laughter from another guard at the door. "We don't run a petting zoo," he muttered, shaking his head. But not everyone was laughing. One officer standing in the corner felt something stir in his chest. He'd been on the job long enough to see men ask for everything under the sun before their executions: meals fit for kings, cases of soda, mountains of candy. But he had never once heard a man ask for a dog. The warden didn't laugh either. His face, though unreadable, revealed a flicker of surprise. He scribbled something on his clipboard, then turned sharply. "We'll see," he said, voice clipped, and walked away. That "we'll see" became the seed of a storm. Within hours, word spread through the prison. Death row inmates whispered about it in hushed voices through the vents. Some mocked Michael, saying it was pathetic. Others quietly admitted they admired the request. Guards argued about it in the break room, one slamming his coffee mug on the table. This isn't some charity case. He's here because he's guilty. Letting him see a dog? It's a circus. Another guard, younger and less hardened, pushed back. It's not about guilt. It's about, I don't know, decency. If a man's about to die, what's the harm in letting him see his dog? The debate grew louder, sharper. Soon, it wasn't just inside the prison. Someone leaked the story to the press. By the next morning, headlines appeared online. Death row inmate's final request, to see his dog. It spread fast. On social media, some reacted with scorn. He should have thought about that before he committed his crime, one commenter wrote. A dog doesn't erase what he did. Others, however, felt their hearts tug. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. Let him see his dog, another replied. Talk shows picked it up, radio hosts debated it, and activists seized the moment. Outside the prison, a small group of protesters gathered, some holding signs that read "Mercy for Max" and "Compassion in Justice." Inside, Michael heard only fragments. Guards passed by his cell and muttered under their breath. Some smirked, calling him desperate. Others ignored him altogether. But Michael didn't care about their opinions. For the first time in years, he felt something other than numb resignation. He felt hope. At night, he lay awake, his hands folded behind his head. He thought of Max. He pictured his dog as he had last seen him, still young, still full of energy. He imagined the feel of Max's fur beneath his fingers, the warmth of his breath, the way the dog leaned into him like he was the only safe place in the world. For hours, Michael let himself believe it might happen. The next day, the warden returned. His voice was calm, deliberate, his expression one of practiced neutrality. Your request has been noted. It is unusual. He paused. But unusual doesn't mean impossible. Michael's heart skipped. He opened his mouth to thank him, but the warden raised a hand. Don't thank me yet. It has to be approved at higher levels. There are rules, liabilities, and security risks. Bringing an animal onto prison grounds isn't standard protocol. Please, Michael said quietly. He's all I have left. The warden studied him for a long moment, then turned and left without another word. Days dragged on. Every footstep outside Michael's cell made his chest tighten. Would it be the warden with news? Would it be a denial? Prison life continued in its monotonous rhythm, but for Michael, time felt distorted, stretched thin by the weight of uncertainty. In the cafeteria, guards argued openly. If we start letting inmates see dogs, what's next? Horses? Cats? Family barbecues in the yard? One snapped. Another guard, older and wearier, shook his head. You don't get it. This isn't about rules. It's about giving a man his last moment of peace. That dog. It's the only piece of humanity he has left. The warden wrestled with the decision. He reviewed the prison manual, considered liability issues, and consulted with higher authorities. Some advised against it. Others told him it could avoid unnecessary controversy, maybe even bring positive publicity to a system often accused of being heartless. Meanwhile, letters began to pour in from strangers across the country. Some condemned the request, saying justice should be blind to sentiment. But many more begged for compassion. Let him see his dog, one woman wrote. We all make mistakes, but no one should leave this world without a chance to say goodbye to the one soul who loved them unconditionally. Michael never saw the letters, but he could feel the shift. Guards who once mocked him now looked at him with quiet curiosity. Some softened, no longer calling him the dead man walking, but simply Johnson. It was as if, by asking for something so small, He had reminded everyone that beneath the orange jumpsuit, he was still human. And yet, uncertainty gnawed at him. Each night, he pictured Max, older now, maybe grayer around the muzzle. He wondered if Max would recognize him. Would the dog leap into his arms? Or would the years apart have erased their bond? The questions kept him awake, heart pounding in the dark. One evening, as lights dimmed across the row, a fellow inmate whispered through the vent. "Hey, Johnson." Michael turned his head. "Yeah? You really asked to see your dog?" "Yeah," Michael replied softly. There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. "Man, that's the first decent thing I've heard in this place in years." Michael smiled faintly, though no one could see it. For a moment, the weight of death row lifted, replaced by a fragile thread of hope. What had started as a simple request was now more than just a man wanting to see his dog. It had become a question echoing far beyond the prison walls. Could mercy exist in a place built on punishment? And Michael waited, day after day, for the answer. For Michael, memories of Max weren't just fragments of the past. They were lifelines. Each recollection carried him back to a time before steel bars, before shackles, before the cold routine of prison life. In the stillness of his cell, those memories replayed like cherished films, offering him brief escapes from the reality of death row. He remembered the day Max first came into his life. Michael had been 26, drifting between jobs, his life already teetering on the edge of collapse. Bills stacked higher than his paychecks, relationships soured, and every decision seemed to push him closer to ruin. One rainy afternoon, a friend had called, saying he knew someone giving away puppies. Michael hadn't planned on adopting a dog. He could barely care for himself, but something nudged him to go. When he arrived, he was met with a box of squirming, curious pups. They were all adorable, but one in particular caught his eye, a golden Labrador with floppy ears and oversized paws. Unlike the others, who wrestled and yipped, this pup sat quietly in the corner, staring at Michael with calm, watchful eyes. There was something steady in that gaze, something grounding. "I'll take him," Michael had said, surprising even himself. From the moment Max trotted into his apartment, clumsy paws slipping on the linoleum, Michael's life felt just a little less heavy. That first night, Max curled up on an old blanket at the foot of his bed. By morning, he had climbed up beside Michael, snoring softly against his chest. From then on, they were inseparable. Max grew fast. He was playful, loyal, and endlessly forgiving. When Michael came home late, smelling of sweat and regret, Max didn't scold. He greeted him with wagging tail and eager eyes. When Michael skipped meals to save money, Max seemed to understand, pressing his warm head against Michael's knee, as if to say, "We'll get through this." There were nights when Michael sat alone in the dark, haunted by the poor choices piling up around him. Drinking too much, running with the wrong crowd, chasing quick money that always slipped through his fingers. In those moments, it was Max who pulled him back. The dog would nudge his arm, insist on a walk, or drop a slobbery tennis ball at his feet. It was impossible to sink completely when Max demanded love so persistently. Neighbors often commented on their bond. "That dog follows you like a shadow," one old woman said. She wasn't wrong. Wherever Michael went, Max was there on late-night jogs, at the park, even riding shotgun in his beat-up car with the windows rolled down. But Max wasn't just loyal. He was protective. One night, as Michael stumbled home from a bar, two men followed him, their footsteps echoing in the alley. Before fear could fully grip him, Max growled a deep, primal sound Michael had never heard before. Hackles raised, teeth bared, the Labrador stood between Michael and the men. They didn't stay long after that. Max wasn't violent, but he didn't need to be. His presence alone was enough to keep danger at bay. Years later, when Michael's world collapsed entirely, and he found himself arrested. It was Max who gave him the hardest goodbye. The night of the arrest was burned into his memory. Flashing lights bathed the street in red and blue. Sirens wailed, and officers shouted commands. Michael was shoved into the back of a squad car, wrists cuffed tightly behind him. Through the rear window, he saw Max at the front door, barking frantically, scratching to get out. His cousin, who had rushed over when police called, had to hold the dog back as Michael was driven away. That image haunted him, the desperate eyes of his dog watching him disappear into the night. After the trial, after the sentence, after the first year on death row, Michael learned that his cousin had taken Max in. The letters he received occasionally mentioned the dog. "He's doing good," one line read. Another time, "He waits at the window every day." Sometimes there'd be a photo Max lying in the yard, tongue lolling or sitting patiently by the door. Michael would trace the pictures with his fingers, pretending for a moment he could feel Max's fur beneath his skin. But as years passed, the letters grew fewer. The photos stopped. His cousin moved to another state. Contact dwindled until silence replaced it. Michael didn't know if Max was still alive. Logic told him the dog must be old now, perhaps gone. But his heart refused to believe it. He clung to the hope that Max was still out there, waiting. That hope gave him strength in the bleakest moments. When guards taunted him, when nights stretched endlessly, when the countdown to his execution loomed heavier with each day Michael thought of Max, he imagined the dog bounding across a field, ears flapping, tail wagging. He imagined the weight of Max's head resting on his lap, the warmth of his breath. Those images kept Michael from unraveling entirely. And so, when the chance for a final request came, his mind had been clear. There was nothing else he wanted, nothing else that mattered. He didn't crave steak, pie, or luxury. He didn't long for one last cigarette or the touch of sunshine on his skin. All he wanted was Max. In the eyes of the world, Michael was a criminal, guilty of terrible mistakes. But in Max's eyes, those warm, trusting eyes, he was simply his person. That bond had never broken, not through distance, not through years, not through prison walls. And as Michael lay awake in his cell, night after night, he prayed, if he deserved nothing else. If mercy was too much to ask from people, then maybe, just maybe, fate would allow him one last moment with the dog who had loved him when no one else would. The prison was never truly quiet, but there were moments when the noise changed, when whispers replaced shouts, when the air seemed heavier than usual. Ever since Michael's unusual request reached the warden's desk, the atmosphere on death row shifted. Guards, staff, and even inmates found themselves caught in an argument that stretched far beyond the gray walls of the facility. It began in the staff room, where corrections officers gathered around a warm coffee pot, steam curling into the air. "This is ridiculous," one officer muttered, slamming his cup down. "A dog? He's not a kid in a hospital bed. He's a convict on death row." Across the table, another guard shrugged. "So what? He's gonna die in a week. What's the harm in letting him see the mutt?" "The harm," the first shot back, "is precedent. You let one guy bring a dog in here, the next thing you know, they'll be asking for visits from horses, cats, who knows what else. Rules are rules for a reason." But others weren't convinced. One younger officer leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "I've been here 5 years. Seen 8 executions. Know what they all asked for? Food, cigarettes, booze. This is different." A guy didn't even flinch when they offered him steak. All he wanted was his dog. "Tell me that doesn't mean something." The room fell into a tense silence. Even the veterans, men hardened by years of watching condemned prisoners shuffle to their fate, couldn't quite dismiss it. Outside, the debate spread like wildfire. A reporter, tipped off by a prison clerk, broke the story online. Death row inmate rejects last meal, asks only to see his dog. The headline exploded across news feeds within hours. Talk shows picked it up, newspapers ran with it, and social media lit up with arguments. Some were outraged. Why waste taxpayer money on this nonsense? One comment read, "He should have thought of his dog before committing the crime." Others, though, felt differently. "I don't care what he did," another person wrote. "That dog loves him. If that's his last wish, grant it." Within days, small groups of activists gathered outside the prison gates, holding signs. "Compassion costs nothing. Mercy for Max. Justice with humanity." But across the street, counter-protesters formed. Their signs were harsher. "No mercy for killers. Dogs deserve better than criminals. Justice first. Sympathy last." Television cameras swiveled between the two groups, capturing the shouting matches that erupted daily. For the first time in years, the prison wasn't just a fortress of punishment. It was the center of a moral storm. Inside, the warden felt the pressure. He was no stranger to controversy. His job demanded difficult decisions. But this request was different. It wasn't in the rule book. Allowing a dog into the facility posed security risks, liability issues, and would require approval from state officials. Yet, he couldn't deny the humanity in it. Late one evening, he sat in his office reviewing reports when his deputy entered. "Sir, we've had over 200 calls today about Johnson's request." Half supportive, half furious, the warden rubbed his temples. "We run a prison, not a circus. But this isn't just about him anymore. It's about what people think we stand for." The deputy hesitated. "So, what do we do?" The warden didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the file on his desk, Michael Johnson's case, thick with transcripts, photos, and testimonies. He knew the man's crimes. He knew why the jury had condemned him. And yet, reading through it, one fact lingered. Michael had never once asked for leniency, never begged for freedom. Only this: in the cell block, inmates buzzed with their own opinions. Some mocked Michael relentlessly, shouting through the vents, "Hey, Johnson, you gonna ask for belly rubs too? Better hope your dog don't bite the warden." But others, hardened men who rarely showed emotion, admitted grudging respect. One lifer whispered through the bars, "That's the first real thing I've heard in here. Not food, not smokes. Just his dog." Makes you think. Michael stayed quiet through it all. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He simply waited, clutching the hope that someone, somewhere, would allow his request. At night, he whispered Max's name, as though calling it across the miles would keep their bond alive. Meanwhile, the media frenzy deepened. Opinion pieces filled newspapers. Should humanity have a place in justice? A dog's love versus society's rules. The strange case of Michael Johnson's final request. Psychologists weighed in on television, arguing that the request showed remorse, or at least the longing for unconditional love. Victims' advocates pushed back, saying compassion for criminals diminished the suffering of victims' families. Caught in the middle were ordinary citizens, torn between their belief in justice and their sympathy for a man's simple wish. The pressure reached a breaking point when the governor's office received petitions, thousands of signatures demanding Michael be allowed to see Max. At the same time, counter-petitions arrived, equally fierce, calling the request an insult to justice. Inside the prison, guards felt the strain. Some hardened further, determined to treat Michael coldly. Others softened, sneaking him extra time outside his cell, quietly acknowledging the weight of what was happening. One guard, a father of two, stopped by Michael's cell late one night. He didn't speak long, just muttered, "I had a dog when I was a kid. Best friend I ever had. I get it." Then he walked away before anyone could notice. Michael sat on his cot, head in his hands, overwhelmed. For the first time in years, he felt seen not as a number, not as a criminal, but as a man who loved something beyond himself. But with recognition came uncertainty. Every day closer to the execution date, every hour that ticked by, left the question unanswered. Would his wish be granted? Or would the system shut the door on him, denying him the one thing he longed for most? The tension grew unbearable. The prison was no longer just a place of concrete and steel. It had become a battleground between law and compassion, between rules and humanity, between the past Michael couldn't erase and the love he refused to forget. And as the days dwindled, the world outside watched with bated breath, waiting to see if a man on death row would be allowed one last embrace with his dog. The morning of the scheduled meeting arrived with a heavy, unshakable stillness. Prison mornings were usually filled with clanging doors, sharp orders, and the shuffle of feet on concrete. But today, every sound carried a weight. The guards moved more quietly, their faces taut. Word had spread. The warden had granted the request. Michael Johnson would see his dog. The decision hadn't come easily. Hours of phone calls, debates with legal advisors, and heated discussions with state officials had dragged on until late the night before. Finally, the warden signed the order. A single sentence authorized it. Permission granted for inmate Johnson to have a supervised final meeting with his dog under secure conditions. That morning, Michael sat on the edge of his cot, hands trembling slightly. He had been told only that it would happen today, but not when. He tried to steady his breathing, but his heart thudded like a drum. He had imagined this moment so many times that it felt unreal, like a dream, stitched together by hope and desperation. At 9 a.m., 2 guards appeared outside his cell. Neither spoke at first. One unlocked the door, while the other gestured. "On your feet, Johnson." "Let's go." The clink of shackles echoed as they fastened chains around his wrists and ankles. Michael's body moved stiffly, but his eyes were alive with anticipation. The guards led him down the long hallway, the echo of their steps bouncing against the concrete walls. Inmates pressed against their cell bars, watching silently. Some smirked, some shook their heads, but most stayed quiet. For once, there was no mockery. When Michael emerged into the yard, he squinted against the sunlight. The sky was sharp and blue, a rare gift in early spring. Beyond the chain-link fence topped with razor wire, a small group had gathered: the prison chaplain, the warden, a veterinarian for safety, and most importantly, Michael's sister, holding a leash. At the end of that leash was Max. The dog was older now, his muzzle frosted with white, but his body still strong. His ears twitched at every sound, and when his eyes locked on Michael, his entire body erupted with recognition. Max barked once, a sharp, joyous cry, then strained against the leash, pulling with all his strength. Michael stopped dead in his tracks. His breath hitched, his chest heaving as though he'd been punched. For a moment, he couldn't move. The sight of Max, the dog who had waited by the door for him, who had curled up beside him through lonely nights, who had never judged him, was almost too much to bear. The warden gave a small nod. Michael was guided forward, chains rattling with each step. When Max finally reached him, the dog lunged forward, nearly knocking Michael off balance. His tail wagged furiously, his paws scraped against the prisoner's chest, and his tongue darted out to cover Michael's face with frantic kisses. Michael dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain from the shackles. His forehead pressed against Max's, his arms wrapped awkwardly around the dog's body. His shoulders shook, and for the first time in years, he wept openly. The yard fell silent. Guards, staff, even the warden, all stood frozen watching. Hardened men and women who had seen executions, riots, and despair beyond imagination found themselves blinking back tears. Michael whispered hoarsely, his voice breaking. Good boy. My good boy. I'm so sorry, Max. I'm so damn sorry. Max whined, pawing at Michael's chest, as if to say he understood, as if forgiveness was already his to give. For several minutes, the world seemed to pause. The dog refused to leave Michael's side, pressing close, ears twitching at his master's voice. Michael clung to him as if the chains were gone, as if the prison walls had melted away. The chaplain lowered his head, whispering a prayer under his breath. One guard, the younger officer who had defended the request earlier, discreetly wiped his eyes. Even the warden, stoic and unmoved by years of duty, felt his throat tighten. Reporters outside the gates weren't allowed inside, but cameras captured the distant sound of Max barking, his joyful cries echoing faintly through the prison walls. By the afternoon, leaked photos of the meeting snapped discreetly by a staff member circulated online. The image of a chained man holding his dog flooded screens across the country. Inside the yard, Michael continued stroking Max's fur, speaking in fragments. Remember the park? Chasing sticks? You never got tired? I don't deserve you, buddy. Max tilted his head, tongue lolling, as though listening intently. After half an hour, the veterinarian cleared his throat softly. The meeting was supposed to last only 15 minutes, but no one had the heart to interrupt. The warden finally stepped forward, his voice firm but not unkind. Time's up. The words sliced through Michael like a blade. He buried his face in Max's fur one last time, inhaling deeply, memorizing the scent, the warmth, the heartbeat against his chest. Goodbye, Max. Be good. Live happy. I love you. His sister, tears streaming down her face, gently tugged on the leash. Max resisted, whining, refusing to move. Michael released him slowly, chains clinking as his hands fell back to his lap. Guards helped him to his feet. But Max wouldn't leave. He twisted, barked, pulled, his eyes locked on Michael. The dog's cries echoed across the yard, raw and piercing. Michael turned, looking back as he was escorted away. His eyes glistened, his lips trembling. For a brief second, man and dog locked gazes, both unwilling to let go. Then the gates closed, steel slamming shut, cutting the bond in half. The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the guards shifted uncomfortably, as though they had witnessed something too intimate, too human, to belong in a prison yard. Back in his cell, Michael sat on his cot, wrists sore from the chains, but heart strangely light. He whispered Max's name over and over, as though keeping the dog alive inside him. He knew the reunion had been brief, but it was enough. It had filled the void left by years of separation, had reminded him that even in the darkest of places, love could not be chained. Outside the prison walls, the story exploded. The photo of Michael kneeling as Max leapt into his arms became a symbol of unconditional love. News anchors described it as one of the most moving moments ever witnessed on death row. Hashtags trended worldwide. Debates reignited with new intensity. But within the prison, in the hearts of those who had seen it with their own eyes, the debate no longer mattered. What they had witnessed wasn't about guilt or innocence, crime or punishment. It was about a man and his dog, about loyalty that outlasted years, bars, and chains. And though the world would keep arguing, though justice would keep turning its gears, the memory of that day lingered. A condemned man kneeling in chains, whispering apologies to the one creature who had never stopped loving him. It was a day no one inside those walls would ever forget. The day after Michael's reunion with Max, the prison buzzed with a strange energy. Something had shifted. Guards who once sneered at Michael now gave him silent nods. Inmates whispered about the meeting as though it were legend. Even the staff in the administration building found themselves discussing it in hushed tones, replaying the image of a man in chains collapsing into the arms of his dog. But while the prison walls hummed with memory, the world outside was on fire. The leaked photos of the reunion spread like wildfire across news outlets and social media platforms. Major newspapers ran headlines like, "The Hug That Broke Death Row," "Unconditional Love in the Face of Death," "Michael Johnson and His Dog, A Final Goodbye That Moved the World." Morning shows replayed commentary from witnesses, while talk radio debated endlessly. Was Michael's request a sign of humanity deserving of mercy, or simply manipulation by a guilty man? What nobody expected was how fast the story escalated beyond sentiment. By noon the following day, the governor's office was flooded with thousands of phone calls, emails, and petitions. Half of them demanded clemency, insisting that Michael's display of love proved he was not the monster he'd been painted to be. The other half roared with outrage, furious that the justice system might bend to emotion. The governor himself, a man with an upcoming re-election campaign, sat in his office staring at his advisors. "Sir," one aide said carefully, "the reunion photo has gone viral. We're talking millions of views. There's even a fundraising campaign to hire a new legal team for Johnson." Another aide cut in sharply. "And we're getting pressure from the victims' families. They're furious. They say this spectacle is spitting on their pain." The governor tapped his pen against the desk, the weight of politics pressing down like a vice. "What about the legal team? Any new evidence?" The first aide hesitated. "There's chatter online. A journalist claims to have uncovered inconsistencies in Johnson's trial transcripts. A suppressed witness statement, maybe. If that's true, then this just got complicated," the governor finished grimly. Back in his cell, Michael had no idea of the storm brewing beyond the razor wire. For him, the reunion had been everything. He spent hours replaying the feeling of Max's fur against his hands, the sound of his bark, the warmth of his body pressed against him. It was enough, he told himself. He could go to his death now with peace in his heart. But that night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, the corridor lights flickering faintly, he heard a guard approach. Keys rattled. A voice whispered through the bars. "Johnson, you hearing the news?" Michael sat up slowly. "What news?" The guard glanced around before leaning closer. "Word is the governor might delay your execution." Something about new evidence. Michael froze. His breath caught in his throat. "Delay? You mean stay it?" The guard shrugged. "Don't know. Could be talk. Could be real. But the dog thing? It's blown up. People see you different now." Michael's mind reeled. He had spent years accepting his fate, carrying the weight of his guilt like a stone. Yet now, when he was finally ready to let go, hope clawed its way back in. The next morning, it became official. At precisely 10:14 a.m., the warden received a sealed envelope from the governor's office. He opened it, read the words, and felt the air leave his lungs. Effective immediately, the execution of Michael Johnson is stayed pending further investigation. The announcement rippled through the prison like an earthquake. Guards whispered, inmates banged on their bars in disbelief, and staff members exchanged wide-eyed looks. In the visitation room, Michael's sister burst into tears when she heard the news. Outside the gates, protesters erupted, half cheering, half cursing. Michael himself received the news in stunned silence. The warden came to his cell personally, flanked by 2 deputies. "Johnson," the warden said gruffly, "the governor's granted a stay. Your execution is on hold." Michael's lips parted, but no words came. His chest rose and fell, his hands trembled, and finally he let out a shaky breath. "Why?" he whispered. The warden paused. His eyes, usually cold and steady, softened just slightly. "The world saw you with that dog. They saw something they couldn't ignore. And now, new evidence is being reviewed." Michael sat back on his cot, his chains rattling faintly. He closed his eyes. The image of Max's face filled his mind. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man walking to his grave. He felt like a man waiting for an answer. But the stay was not a pardon, and Michael knew it. Every hour became a new torment of waiting for lawyers, waiting for appeals, waiting for decisions made by people he would never meet. The uncertainty pressed harder than the certainty of death ever had. Some guards became more sympathetic, offering kind words or extra privileges. Others grew harsher, resentful of the attention Michael now commanded. In the chow hall, whispers followed him everywhere. Dogs saved his life. Man's got the whole country crying for him. Bet he walks free now. But Michael didn't let the gossip in. He thought only of Max. He replayed the reunion again and again, drawing strength from the memory. Whatever happened, now freedom or the chair, he had been given something priceless, a chance to say goodbye. Outside, the legal firestorm intensified. The journalist who hinted at suppressed evidence published her findings in full. A witness who had recanted their testimony, claiming they had been pressured by prosecutors during the original trial. Questions of misconduct swirled. News anchors debated for hours whether Michael might actually be innocent. And through it all, one image kept flashing across screens, the moment Max leapt into Michael's arms. That single frame became the heart of the argument, a symbol of humanity too powerful to ignore. Weeks later, Michael sat in the visitation room once again, across from his attorney. She leaned in, voice low but steady. "We're filing an appeal based on the new witness statement. The governor's already under pressure to commute your sentence. This could change everything." Michael swallowed hard. His hands trembled. "So, I might not die?" His lawyer met his eyes. "It's possible, but it's going to be a fight." Michael leaned back, overwhelmed. His heart ached with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And somewhere beyond those walls, in a modest home with a worn-out dog bed by the fire, Max dozed peacefully, still waiting, still loyal, unaware that his love had just altered the course of his master's life. That day in the yard was supposed to be a final goodbye. Instead, it became the spark that set everything ablaze. A condemned man had asked only to see his dog, and in granting that request, the world discovered something far greater than anyone expected. The execution was no longer certain. Michael Johnson's story was no longer finished. The twist no one saw coming had just begun. The stay of execution bought Michael time, but time in prison was a strange, double-edged thing. Each day felt endless, yet the weeks passed like water through cupped hands. Outside the walls, the battle over his fate raged hotter than ever. Inside, he waited, suspended between life and death. Michael tried not to cling too tightly to hope, but it seeped into him like light through cracks. Every night he lay on his cot, whispering Max's name, remembering the reunion, imagining the dog's face pressed to his chest. That single moment had become the anchor holding him steady against the storm. And what a storm it was. The governor, under relentless pressure, called for a special review of Michael's case. A panel of lawyers, judges, and former prosecutors was convened to examine the trial transcripts, the new witness statement, and the allegations of misconduct. The hearings were closed door, but leaks trickled into the press like drops of gasoline on a fire. Key witness admits being pressured to testify. Evidence mishandled in Johnson. Trial. Prosecutors under investigation for ethical violations. The public, already emotionally invested after the reunion photo, now began to question not just Michael's guilt, but the integrity of the entire case. Television studios turned the story into a spectacle. Analysts argued nightly. "He's manipulating everyone with that dog," one guest declared. Manipulation? That was raw humanity. Another shot back. Even if he's guilty, Does the system have the right to execute someone when doubt exists? Polls revealed a startling divide. Nearly half the country now believed Michael might be innocent. The other half demanded the execution go forward, seeing the dog reunion as a distraction from justice. In the prison yard, Michael heard echoes of the debate from guards' radios and passing conversations. He never asked for updates, but they reached him anyway. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He had spent years resigned to death. Now, with hope forced back into his chest, every heartbeat felt like a question. One night, he confided in the chaplain. "I don't know if I want this," Michael said quietly, staring at the floor. The chaplain frowned. "You don't want to live?" Michael shook his head. "I do. God, I do. But hope hurts. Waiting hurts. I'd made peace with the end. Now, it feels like I'm being torn in two." The chaplain put a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes hope is the cruelest gift, but sometimes it's the only one that matters." Then came the announcement that shook the nation. The governor would personally decide Michael's fate. After weeks of review, after endless arguments, the choice had narrowed to two options: uphold the death sentence and proceed with the execution. Commute the sentence to life imprisonment without parole. It was unprecedented, but the governor explained his reasoning at a press conference. "The case raises serious questions," he said solemnly. "This decision is not only about justice for the past, but about the integrity of our system moving forward." The date was set. In 3 days, the governor would announce his decision. Those 3 days stretched like years inside the prison. Protesters gathered in greater numbers outside the gates. One side chanted for mercy, the other for justice. Signs waved, cameras rolled, and helicopters circled overhead. Inside, Michael waited in silence. He barely ate. He barely slept. He thought of Max, constantly imagining him sleeping by the fire, playing in the yard, waiting by the door as always. He wondered if he'd ever see him again. On the morning of the third day, Michael was led to the visitation room to meet his sister. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "They're saying..." She stopped, swallowing hard. "They're saying it could go either way." Michael reached across the table, chains rattling. "Whatever happens, thank you for bringing Max. That was all I needed." His sister's eyes filled with tears. "No, you deserve more than that. You deserve the truth." At exactly 6 p.m., the governor appeared before cameras, his face grave, his voice measured. The nation held its breath. After thorough review of the evidence, testimony, and new findings, he began. "I cannot, in good conscience, allow the execution to proceed. The sentence of death is hereby commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." For a moment, the world seemed to exhale all at once. Reporters shouted questions. Protesters erupted in cheers and fury alike. And television anchors scrambled to deliver the breaking news. Inside his cell, Michael sat on his cot, listening to the announcement through a guard's radio. His hands shook, his chest tightened, and finally, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Life, not freedom. Not exoneration, but life. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, "Thank you." The reaction outside was immediate and explosive. Supporters celebrated, hailing the decision as a victory for justice and humanity. Opponents condemned it as a betrayal of victims and the rule of law. Politicians weighed in, some applauding the governor's courage, others accusing him of bowing to public pressure. But beyond the noise, one truth remained: Michael Johnson would live. That night, Michael dreamed of Max. He saw the dog bounding toward him in the prison yard again, tail wagging furiously, eyes shining with love. In the dream, there were no chains, no fences, no guards. Just a man and his dog running together under a sky without walls. When he awoke, tears streaked his face. He knew he would never leave prison, never taste freedom again. But he also knew that life, even behind bars, meant possibility. It meant letters, visits, maybe even one more chance to see Max someday. And for a man who had once resigned himself to die in silence, that possibility was everything. The decision shook everyone differently. For some, it was proof that compassion still had a place in justice. For others, it was an outrage, a dangerous precedent. But for Michael, it was simply this: a second chance not at freedom, but at life itself. The reunion with Max had been meant as a final goodbye. Instead, it had sparked a movement, a review, and a decision that changed the course of his story forever. And though the world outside would keep debating, though opinions would rage for years, Michael carried one unshakable truth in his heart. It wasn't a lawyer or a governor or a judge who had saved him. It was his dog. The governor's decision rippled through the country like a shockwave. News outlets replayed the announcement over and over, breaking it down from every angle. Analysts debated its implications for the justice system. Protesters continued to gather, but the tone had shifted. What had once been a march towards certain death was now an ongoing fight for truth, for identity, for justice itself. But inside his prison cell, Michael Johnson lived a much quieter reality. The first morning after the commutation, he woke to the same sound he had heard for years: the clang of steel doors, the shuffle of guards' boots, the murmur of men moving through narrow corridors. Nothing about the world around him had changed. And yet, everything had. For the first time in more than a decade, he wasn't counting down to his death. He sat up slowly, hands rubbing his tired face. The ceiling above looked the same as always, the same dull gray, the same cracks from years of wear. But to Michael, it no longer looked like the ceiling of a coffin. It looked like a roof over a life-limited, broken, yes, but still alive. Weeks passed, then months. Michael adjusted to his new reality with a strange blend of relief and heaviness. The reprieve from death didn't erase the bars, the chains, or the walls. It didn't erase the whispers of other inmates who believed he should still be gone. It didn't erase the gnawing ache of knowing he'd never again feel the simple freedom of walking outside alone. But it gave him something else: time. And with time came perspective. Michael began to write, at first short letters to his sister, sometimes to volunteers who had written after seeing the story on the news. Soon the letters grew longer, evolving into reflections, even essays. He wrote about prison life, about guilt and innocence, about the way a single moment can brand a man forever. But above all, he wrote about Max. "People think of him as just a dog," he scribbled one evening, "but he was more than that. He was loyalty when the world abandoned me. He was forgiveness when I didn't deserve it. He was proof that love survives walls, bars, and even death sentences." The letters began to circulate. A journalist who had covered his case published one, and soon others followed. Unexpectedly, Michael's words found a readership beyond the prison walls. To some, he became a symbol of resilience. To others, he remained a criminal who should never have been spared. But no one could deny the power of his words. Then came the day that broke him all over again. His sister came during visitation, face pale, hands trembling just as they had on the day of the governor's decision. She sat across from him, lips quivering. "It's Max," she whispered. Michael's heart sank. The dog who had carried him through years of despair, who had sparked a national outcry, who had been the reason he was alive at all, Max was gone. Michael lowered his head, his hands pressed tightly together, and for the first time in months, he wept uncontrollably. Not in the quiet, controlled way of a man used to suffering, but in the raw, broken sobs of a boy who had lost his best friend. The guards looked away. Even they couldn't watch. The grief was unbearable. But even in grief, Michael found something unexpected clarity. Max's love hadn't been wasted. It hadn't been meaningless. That final reunion, those few moments of wagging tail and wet nose pressed to his chest, had sparked the fire that saved him. And though Max was gone, the love remained. Michael poured that grief into writing. His letters became more personal, more urgent. "Max saved me," he wrote, "not just from death row, but from myself. He reminded me that I was still human when I had forgotten. He reminded me that even the condemned are worthy of love." Those words struck a chord. Soon, advocacy groups began sharing his writings, attaching his reflections to broader campaigns against wrongful convictions and the death penalty. Law students cited his case in debates. Professors taught it in ethics classes. The image of a man kneeling with his dog in a prison yard appeared on posters, in documentaries, in articles that circled the globe. Michael, who had once been forgotten, became a voice that echoed far beyond the walls. Years passed. Michael's hair turned gray. His body weakened. But his words lived on, carried by those who saw in him not perfection, but proof of something deeper, that mercy, once shown, can change the course of a life. One day, a young journalist came to visit him. She sat across from him in the same visitation room where he had once heard about Max's passing. She carried a notebook filled with questions, but her first words caught him off guard. "My father," she said softly, "was one of the guards on shift the day you saw Max. He said he'd never seen anything like it. He said it made him believe again in people, in forgiveness. He told me it changed him. And it changed me too. That's why I became a journalist. That's why I'm here." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat. For years, he had wondered if anything he'd lived through had truly mattered. And here was proof his story had reached further than he ever imagined. He smiled faintly, eyes misting. "And Max is still alive," he whispered. The journalist tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Michael leaned back, chains clinking softly. "As long as he's remembered. As long as what he gave me still reaches others. That's life. That's legacy." In the end, Michael Johnson never walked free. He remained behind walls, an old man in a cold cell. But he lived long enough to see the world change around him. He lived long enough to see students march, with signs bearing his words. He lived long enough to hear that his case had inspired new reforms in evidence handling, in witness protection, in prosecutorial accountability. And most of all, he lived long enough to know that his final request, the simple, desperate plea of a man to see his dog one last time, had become more than a request. It had become a story, a reminder, a symbol of what it means to be human. On the night Michael Johnson finally closed his eyes for the last time, it was not the walls of his cell that he saw. It was Max, running toward him once more, ears flopping, tail wagging, eyes filled with joy. And this time, there were no guards to hold him back. No fences, no chains. Just the man and his dog, together again, free at last.